I've been really getting into the character action genre of games lately. Or you could call it stylish action or spectacle fighter if you prefer. I might have played games like Viewtiful Joe and Bayonetta when I was younger, but within the past few years, I've been brushing off on some of the most iconic games the genre has to offer. Heck, I've even fallen for the games I could consider to be adjacent to the character action genre. It's only just recently I've been able to recognize why these games work so well. But there's been a new contender which took me by surprise. A game that, while not flawless, I can safely say is my favorite character action game.
I'm here, baby.
Who are you talking to?
Huh?
Talk about a game that truly came out of nowhere. A studio known primarily for creating dark survival horror games that take themselves quite seriously, comes out swinging with a colorful rhythm action game that never for a moment stops being goofy. The creative passion exuded by this game was enough to catch a lot of people's attention. How were they able to pull off such a creative contrast from their previous work? Well, it's not really that surprising when you consider the history of its creator, Tango Gameworks, and the various projects its key figures have developed in the past. My friends pitched to me the single sentence of, "What if Clover Studio had the chance to make another game?" which then absolutely solidified the purchase without a second thought. Clover Studio is a now disbanded development team from the 2000s that branched off from Capcom Production Studio 4. These were the people who were responsible for games such as Devil May Cry and Viewtiful Joe. And they had the vision for producing original IPs, which led to the creation of other games, such as Okami and God Hand. Although Clover's efforts tragically ended very quickly, the few games they did make are some of the most iconic cult classic titles ever made. Clover Studio didn't just make clones of previous games. They found a way to put a new spin on them, and Hi-Fi Rush fits in beautifully with that legacy, perhaps even more than Bayonetta or Vanquish, two entries from Platinum Games which also carry that same spirit. This game essentially asks what Devil May Cry would be like if it was set to the music. Every action is performed in sync with the rhythm of the background song. When you press the button for an attack, that action will come out on the next available beat of the song. This is able to force the action of the game to coincide with the tempo. It's actually not that unique of a concept when you think about it. There have been numerous games of all kinds that attempt to pull this off. Yet Hi-Fi Rush makes the concept easy to understand and fun to play. Musicians and rhythmically inclined persons are more likely to adjust to this game very quickly. But I was born a white boy and cursed to have no rhythm. In fact, while I was able to get pretty high marks for score and battle duration, just timings were the one criteria I continue to struggle with. That said, the game design is built in such a way that is extremely accommodating to people like me that would otherwise struggle with this combination. And unless there's another game out there that I don't know about, this is the best handling of that concept I've ever seen. There are a few key reasons why I think this approach works incredibly well. The first being aesthetically. Because everything syncs up to the music, it just feels cool to pull off any combo at any time. There's been a few times I've accidentally done actions that correspond with the background song. They're unintentional, but they feel great to pull off. This is a game where that always happens, and it never gets tiring. This framework almost inherently discourages button mashing. If you keep hammering that X button, your inputs won't be synchronized to the action on screen. It will just feel bad. Not to mention one of the criteria you're graded on at the end of battle is how close you match the beat of the song, so you might as well do your best to match the rhythm. But perhaps the most notable consequence of this design choice is that it sort of lowers the skill floor and makes character action games slightly more accessible. There have always been moves in these games that require you to pause your button inputs for a more complicated combo chain. But how much do you delay it? A few frames? A second? I don't ever rely on these moves because of the ambiguous nature of their timing. But in Hi-Fi Rush, I always know a rest combo requires only one beat of the song. Even beyond rest combos, I found it easier to keep track of which combo moves I was performing during battle because of the consistent rhythm I was pressing the buttons to. I'm more aware of when I switch between light and heavy attacks because of the timing they require. In fact, parries are something I almost never use in character action games because I can never seem to figure out when I'm supposed to put my guard up. In Hi-Fi Rush, enemies always attack on the beat, so you always parry on the beat. And because I intrinsically know when that timing occurs, I've been far more likely to parry in this game rather than dodge. which is actually the opposite of how my brain normally works. A game like this also needs a good soundtrack to carry it. What is a good rhythm action game if the beats aren't sick enough to beat enemies with the guitar to them? Hi-Fi Rush, for being a game based around music, went and licensed a variety of songs that play during boss fights and other key story moments. Streamers and video creators can rejoice, however, as the game also includes an option to turn on a streamer mode to replace the licensed songs with original creations from the internal music team. For myself, I actually opted to play Hi-Fi Rush on streamer mode despite the fact I was playing the game alone. I'm happy to report the original soundtrack for this game doesn't come off as phoned in. In fact, this might be the best streamer mode of any game available. There was never a time where I felt there was a lacking vibe, and I would have rather been taking the moment in with a licensed version. I did a playthrough at a later time with the licensed music on, and I honestly prefer the original soundtrack in almost every case. Now, I'm biased in this viewpoint. Not only did I play with the original soundtrack first and for most of my succeeding playthroughs, I also don't have any attachment to the bands that were brought on board, so hearing their songs playing this game would have brought no benefit to me. I also have a bit of a brainworm that's just worried about this game's future when there isn't a physical edition of the game that currently exists. Just how long do the game creators carry the license for these songs? Could they release this game at a later time with just the original songs, or is the legality of this project more complicated than I realize? Oh well, I suppose we'll worry about that when the game is unceremoniously delisted from Game Pass and our Steam licenses are collectively revoked. And sure, the game isn't flawless. For one, there is an absurd amount of platforming for a game whose control scheme was not designed to be a platformer. Even on my best days, I still tend to overshoot a few jumps or fail to perceive environmental depth. I'm still glad that it's here. I think combat is the best part of the game, but I don't want to only do combat for the entire runtime. But these sections do make the game feel like it's dragging on a bit longer than it needs to. Even in combat, there are specific enemies that can only have their defenses broken by summoning a partner character into battle. But these enemies require multiple attacks to have their shields go down, and your partner characters are on a cooldown, slowing down an otherwise fast-paced combat system. Sometimes you're forced into a showdown with a powerful enemy where you have to parry attacks with specific timing. While the rest of the game asks you to time the rhythm of your inputs to quarter notes, these duels require hitting anything from whole notes to eighth notes. While the game is otherwise very forgiving if you don't time every input exactly on the beat, these are a punishing exception. There's even a whole boss fight that is entirely built on this system, and it's sadly the worst boss fight in the game by a country mile. I understand when the benefit is an instant kill on a powerful enemy, but for the boss fight, you can't just tank past the damage if you get hit. If you don't get every single pattern timed perfectly, you're not moving on to the rest of the game. And while these aspects are detrimental, I actually found them to be really minor problems in the grand scheme of things. It's because the core gameplay loop is so enjoyable that I'm willing to put up with the few problems it has. And after a few playthroughs, I kind of just get used to them, and I sort of forget what I even had problems with in the first place. Which is also another aspect of Hi-Fi Rush which completely took me by surprise. For a lot of character action games, most of my old save files exist untouched after playing these games for my first run. Which is kind of strange considering these games are usually built with the attitude that your first playthrough is basically the tutorial, encouraging players to come back for hundreds more hours of mechanical mastery. And yet, I've never been able to buy into that angle. If I'm ever replaying these games, it's been so long since my last playthrough I'd rather just start from a fresh save and work my way up again. But for Hi-Fi Rush, I just kept going. I don't necessarily want to S-rank every stage, but it is a game I can enjoy no matter what. And in the future, I'm going to find any excuse I can to play it again. I don't know if I really want to unlock everything on that achievement board for the golden guitar. However, I don't see why I can't just replay some of my favorite stages with a different costume. Or even if it's just to re-experience my favorite moments from the story again.
I don't need to explain myself to a defect. All you do is hit things with a guitar.
But I'm really good at it.
The story of Hi-Fi Rush isn't very deep. It could more or less be described as a Mad Lib's reinterpretation of Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Yet there is an extremely pervasive style continually pulsing through the entire thing like a healthy heartbeat. Its cel-shaded graphical style is absolutely perfect. It makes me wish more games would adopt the same visuals. Hi-Fi Rush's narrative is carried incredibly hard not only by the vibes, but also the characters. Chai is a 25-year-old college dropout who looks for easy avenues to success rather than putting the hard work to better himself, and has become a washed-up, idiotic loser, but is cheerful and upbeat all the same. Oh my god, literally me! All the characters offer something, if only as another source to spout out jokes to the audience. Now, my taste in humor isn't always highbrow. In fact, I find a lot of really dumb things to be absolutely hysterical. Lucky me, because the humor of this game is composed entirely of utter stupidity.
So this was our pesky test subject. Mr. Chai, was it?
That's Mr. Chai to you.
That's what I just called you.
Okay then.
Hi-Fi Rush takes a rather risky approach to its style of humor. It looks at every scene, every situation, and finds anywhere they can squeeze another joke in. The joke density is so high that you're never more than a minute away from the next one. It will even uproot scenes that should be taken seriously by cramming in another joke.
Was I dope, Mr. Chai?
That was very dope, Cinnamon. Man, he is messed up.
This approach doesn't always work for people, and yet, it's funny because it doesn't put on the brakes. The characters have fully bought into their comic book logic dystopia, and it's just entertaining for the audience to observe. But it can also be really clever about how it introduces and reuses jokes. In one of the earlier missions, you can find a text log from a disgruntled employee upset with his working conditions. To exact revenge on the company, he comes up with a plan to make the coffee machine only output decaf. How devastating. Multiple missions later, by the time you're way past that insignificant log, characters in the main scenario will call back to this moment by expressing frustration about how they're only getting decaf coffee. But even if you missed that initial log or forgot about it, the delivery and timing support the scenario without that reference. Maybe even half the jokes in Hi-Fi Rush are direct homages to something external. And I imagine that a significant portion of the audience are probably going to have a ton of jokes go over their head. But Hi-Fi Rush transforms the reference in such a way that it doesn't feel like you're missing out on something. The inherent silliness of the situation helps carry it along for those who are otherwise ignorant to the context. One of the most hilarious scenes in the game to me upon my initial playthrough was the moment Chai describes his master plan of invading the Vandelay offices. It wasn't until much later I realized it's actually a deliberate nod to one of the most infamous moments in Xenogears, where a major event is explained rather than shown. I've played some Xenogears, but not enough to have made it that far. Even still, Hi-Fi Rush made the joke its own. But I do have to ask something. If anyone at Tango Gameworks is watching this video, I seriously need to know. Who was the guy in the office that had to explain Left Shark to people? Whoever they are, they have my respect. I welcome all Left Shark callbacks in the current year. And speaking of years, why is the CEO's office of Vandelay Technologies on the 776th floor? You can't just put the haha funny Fire Emblem number in there and not expect me to call it out. Now that it's been a while since I first played Hi-Fi Rush, I've been given a lot of time to think about this game. What really speaks to me about Hi-Fi Rush is that it's exactly the kind of game I wanted, while also being something I never knew I wanted. For a long time, I've desired a more colorful character action game that shaves off the darker edge the most famous examples in this genre have. I didn't know a game like that would pair well being focused around a musical theme. I suppose it doesn't always land. Its overall pacing is a bit suspect. I get many feelings that suggest a ton of content was scrapped for time, budget, or inexperience. And I mean more than just the instances the game cheekily tells you about. But who cares, right? Is it too much to say that Hi-Fi Rush almost effortlessly became one of my new favorite games of all time? As I get older, I gradually begin to think I'm running out of room to include more games with the qualifier of being a favorite game. How can something new compete with the memories I've nurtured for years before its existence? But it feels good to get a few shots in the arm. I think more than anything, Hi-Fi Rush is a title that feels proud to be a gosh dang video game. And even if it's not flawless, it's undeniably perfect.